So the sample I'll be walking you through is inspired by an existing sample on the TechNet Script Center. And what that sample does is it allows you to manage Windows updates on an Azure VM using Azure Automation. However, this sample is a couple years old, and it's designed to work with the older Azure Service Management, or often referred to as V1 Azure VMs. It was also written before features like Azure Automation DSC, or Design State Configuration, was available. So what I wanted to do was achieve the same end goal of this set of scripts for Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, or V2 Azure VMs. But I also wanted to take advantage of Azure Automation DSC to ensure the prerequisites for the script execution are deployed to the VM. So to get started, you can come to the GitHub repository and just download the zip. What you'll see are there are two PowerShell files. One is a PowerShell DSC file to install some prerequisites, and the other is the actual Azure Automation runbook. So once you've downloaded it, you'll want to start with the install ps Windows Update and taskrunner.ps1 file. As I mentioned here, this script depends on the package management, and there are instructions on how to install this here, just in case somebody comes across this script that didn't end up watching this video, but I'll actually walk through installing this module. And if you're not familiar with PowerShell DSC, it's a really powerful capability of PowerShell and Windows Server to configure the OS. So you can use DSC to do things like install IIS, ensure a certain set of files are, install third-party MSIs. It's a really powerful tool to ensure that your VMs are configured and stay configured the way that you define declaratively within this file. And so for my configuration, first I need to import a module called Package Management Provider Resource, which will allow DSC to install PowerShell modules from the PowerShell gallery. Once that's imported, I'm defining that I want the PowerShell module called PS Windows Update, and Task Runner to be imported onto the machine. And these two modules have some PowerShell commands that we'll be using from our Azure Automation Runbook. So the first thing we need to do is get this deployed to my server to ensure it has the prerequisites to execute my runbook. So to do that, I'll come over here into my Azure Automation account. The first thing we need to do is add that module that the DSC configuration needs to import. So we'll browse the gallery. We'll search for that module. There it is. And we'll go ahead and import it for use within Azure Automation. All right. And you'll notice down here it's extracting the activities. This will take a minute or two. All right, and through the magic of video editing, I've waited for the module import to be complete, and it's available now. So next thing we need to do is set up a DSC configuration. So we'll go ahead and add a configuration. And I will select that PS1 file, install PS Windows Update and Task Runner. Click OK. The next step we need to do is we need to actually compile the configuration. And what this does is it makes the configuration available to be applied to DSC nodes. All right, so I've edited out the time it took for the compilation to complete, but you can see that my compilation job is completed now. If yours hasn't, it's probably a good time to pause the video. All right, the next thing we need to do is apply that configuration to a virtual machine. The way that you do that is through DSC nodes. So I'll add an Azure VM. I'll select the VM that I want to apply this to. If you have more VMs than I do in this example, you'd see them in the list, and you can apply this to multiple machines. So it's a great way to ensure that machines are consistently configured. And then I'll pick that node configuration that we just compiled. Now PowerShell DSC has different configuration modes that you can read about later, but you can apply and then monitor which basically says, report to me when this node's configuration is inconsistent with what was in that file. Or you can apply an autocorrect, which basically says if DSC notices anything's changed from what you put in that file, it will reapply. I'll go ahead and allow module override, reboot if needed. In this case, a reboot won't be needed. And we'll go ahead and create that. Now what's happening is that this configuration is going to be applied to the VM we just selected. And as you can see, the DSC node is in progress, which basically means PowerShell DSC is applying the configuration. It's installing those modules that I say have to be on that machine. If I click refresh again, you'll now see that the status is compliant. And we can validate that by remoting into the actual virtual machine. And to confirm that, I'll just go ahead and remote into the VM. And we'll take a look in the file system just to prove that PowerShell modules that we need are in fact installed. PS Windows Update and Task Runner. All right, we'll go ahead and end this remote session. All right, so far we've basically used Azure Automation DSC, or desired state configuration, to apply a set of prerequisites onto a VM. Next, we want to upload a runbook that uses those PowerShell modules we've already deployed as a prerequisite. So let's take a look at what this runbook does. So I've put some notes in here and basically said, for simplicity, this script accesses the VM using PowerShell remoting over SSL using a public IP or DNS label. The only way to do this without using a public IP is to use an Azure Automation hybrid runbook worker. And I included a link to help you understand how to do that. This script also assumes that WinRM is already configured on the VM using a self-signed cert. There are a number of ways to accomplish this, and I've provided some links to some great articles that help you get to that end state. Now you may ask yourself, why didn't I do that with PowerShell DSC? Well, in my case, I actually used the approach that's in this article to deploy and configure WinRM as part of my ARM template. And so this script really just takes two things, well, three. It takes an environment so that you can use this in Azure China, Azure Government, and other environments in addition to default Azure Cloud. It takes the computer name that you want to apply updates to, and then it takes a PowerShell credential name. So let's go ahead and create that credential. We'll come back over here to Azure Automation. And we'll create the credential. So the name is going, I just keep it the same as the username. The username that we're going to log into remotely is whatever, any valid credential on that machine. In my case, I'm just going to use devkeydet, and I'll provide a password. So we'll create that. And then this uses the standard run as Azure connection approach to get the connection and add the Azure RM account so that you can start executing scripts. And then we use the PowerShell command get automation PS credential for that credential name that we're going to pass in our case, the one that I just created. Again, I'm re-emphasizing that this script uses WinRM for PowerShell remoting. And if the virtual machine is not configured, you need to make sure it is configured first. And then I use PowerShell remoting to invoke a command using the credential. And because the cert that I've used in this example for my WinRM configuration is a self-signed cert, I need to use some additional session options. But ultimately, now what we're doing is just remotely calling a command called get w install. Get w install is part of the PS Windows Update module that we use PowerShell DSC to deploy to that VM as a prerequisite. And in my case, I'm just saying accept all the updates, do an auto reboot, ignore updates that require user input, and log everything to this log file. Now the trick here is that you can't initiate a Windows update over a PowerShell remote session. So to work around that, I've used another PowerShell module called Task Runner, which will basically execute this PS1 file as a task and wait for that task to complete. So if this workaround weren't necessary, I could just simply do something like this. Make that remote call, but that remote call would actually fail. So instead, we're putting the call that we want to actually execute in a PS1 file, and then we're using this run task command to work around the fact that you can't actually initiate a Windows update over a PowerShell remote session. Got a little error handling in this script, but assuming that these were successful, we need to check for a reboot, because I've used the auto reboot parameter. And so the way that I'm going to check for reboot is to see if I can actually reconnect using PowerShell remoting. So we try to reconnect again, and this time we try to get the values out of the log. If that fails, I'm going to assume that the reboot's still in progress, and we'll wait 30 seconds. And we'll just keep trying until we can reconnect to that machine and dump out the logs. If the content of the logs is empty, then we'll just say that there were no updates applied. Otherwise, we'll just dump out the logs. All right, so let's upload this to Azure Automation. So we'll come into runbooks. We'll add a runbook. We'll import an existing runbook and just point to that PS1 file. It's a PowerShell runbook, and we'll use the same name. Click Create there. Now when you import a runbook, it's going to be in the new authoring status state. So we'll go ahead and publish it. Now, if we were to start this runbook right now, this would fail. And the reason it would fail is because the network security group for this VM doesn't allow WinRM traffic. So let's go fix that. All right, we'll select the network security group. Go to inbound security rules. Add the rule. We'll just grab the predefined WinRM. Call this default. Allow WinRM. All right, and we can see now that I'm allowing WinRM over TCP 5986, which is the default port for WinRM. All right, so now if we go to Azure Automation, we can execute this runbook. We'll use the default for the environment. We'll enter the computer name and give it the name of the credential that we created earlier. Click OK, and this will initiate the running of this runbook. And we can go ahead and take a look at the output. And while this is getting spun up, let's go ahead and remote into the machine. All right, now, so we're connecting to the VM and installing updates. And if I actually go over to the virtual machine here, actually, let's go back to see what it did. So it went ahead and created that file. So let's go prove that over here. This is the file, so we can just edit it. And notice this task scripts folder, that's sort of the temporary location to execute this PowerShell script using a task. And again, if we go to this log file, you'll see that these are the updates that it found. And eventually, once this whole process is complete, we will see that in the output window here. All right, so in the interest of time, I've gone ahead and edited out the time it took to actually check for and install the updates, but what you can see now is my remote desktop session was terminated. I'm in fact checking for reboot. The server itself is actually rebooting right now, and I'm checking for reboot in the script. So the script was able to reconnect to the server, and it was able to dump out the logs from that log file on the remote server. And we can see that we accepted, downloaded, and installed 3 updates. If I scroll over here, you'll see that the job completed. All right, so to summarize, I showed you how to take the sample scripts that I created and use Azure Automation with PowerShell DSC to ensure that the VM that we want to apply updates to has the prerequisite PowerShell modules deployed to it, and then how to use an Azure Automation runbook to initiate the Windows update process on the remote machine using PowerShell remoting.